Hey guys, Ben Pierce on the Roadster Tracker, and today we're going to talk about the exploration of the moon. Now, this is a very, very difficult thing to do because, quite frankly, there has been an enormous amount of exploration of the moon compared to any of the other celestial bodies because it's so close and so easy. I mean, we've sent humans there, for crying out loud, compared to Mars or anywhere else. We haven't sent humans. So it's really cool, and quite frankly, you can look up at the moon and you can already get some kind of a sense of what's there, even with just the naked eye. Whereas every other planet is just a dot. Maybe technically it could be resolved, but not really. Not without a telescope or binoculars or something like that. And so let's talk about the history of our knowledge and exploration of the moon here. And we're only really going to hit the highlights. So the moon obviously has been known since antiquity. Even the animals recognize the moon. This is super, super obvious and really an important thing. It's fairly easy to tell that the moon is a sphere. Really, it kind of surprises me that anybody would see anything else. You can see this easily by looking at the shadows, and you can see the texture that would happen, and the only way that that happens is if it's a spherical type of object. It will actually move around. Most of it's tidally locked to the Earth, so there's a whole hemisphere that we did not see until we started to enter the space race, but it was there. But we could see little parts of the moon that's hidden. It's a little hard to explain, but the moon kind of vibrates around, and we can actually see about 55% of it, depending on exactly the time of year. Never more than half of it, but we can see some of the edge parts a little bit. In the days of the Greeks, they recognized that the sun and the moon were both spherical. We know that they're actually not quite spherical, but they're pretty close. And that the sun casts light on the moon, which is fairly easy to tell if you go look right at sunset. If you see the moon, then the part of it that is lit will be pointing towards the sun, and you can tell, hey, the light's coming from the same source on both of them. And it's a pretty cool thing that you can do. The moon was thought to be a perfect sphere at one point in time, even though you can see some of the texture, and I don't really understand how they would think that. It would have texture, but not any kind of, terrain texture, just a color texture. But it was pretty easily recognized with telescopes that it was in fact had mountains and had a lot of surface features on there. It took them some time to realize that by the 1800s we realized that it had no significant atmosphere, which we do know it technically has a very, very thin atmosphere, but it's not really worth speaking of because it is essentially a vacuum. The exploration of the moon by spacecraft and eventually by humans is really a story of the space race. And so to really understand that, you have to delve in here. And the moon, more than any other celestial object, except for perhaps Earth, is really characterized by the visiting of spacecraft and by the space race in what it did. It happened a little bit on Venus and a little bit on Mars, but it was really, really the central focus of the space race. With over 100 missions to the moon, we're not going to talk about every one of them. Most of the early ones actually failed because we were still learning how to launch rockets. Most of them failed at some point in time in the launch sequence. Some of them failed on their way towards the moon, but really, we had to learn how to build these rockets and do this. So the first major goal of the space race was to hit the moon. And one of the things that came up was, how can we actually prove that we have hit the moon in a way that will be easily recognized? And well, one of the early ideas was, it was the 50s. What do you do in the 50s? If you want to do something showy, you use nuclear weapons. So they thought, hey, why don't we just take a nuclear weapon and launch it towards the moon, and then, right before it hits, will cause it to explode, and then you can easily tell that, hey, something was there on the moon. You see that little bright dot there? You could broadcast when it was going to happen so that people would know to look for it in advance, and it would be 100% proof positive to half of the globe that we had made something go to the moon. That never ended happening. While there were some nuclear tests, they were all in some variation of Earth orbit. We never sent one to the moon, so the moon has not been nuked. At least not, literally. There have been some nuclear reactors that were sent there of the type of RTGs, but we're not really going to talk about that. The first attempts failed, as with most things. The first Soviet mission was Luna 1. It failed in its navigation algorithms. It got fairly close to the moon, although it still was more than 25% of the distance between the Earth and Moon away from there. But it ended up flying around the sun instead. The first US mission to attempt the same thing was Pioneer 4, and it did exactly the same type of thing, that it flew around the moon and ended up going around the sun because they had not aimed right. The first successful hard landing was a Soviet mission, Luna 2, and this happened in September of 1959. They did not have any kind of imaging stuff on there, so they weren't able to actually see the moon. It was really just a propaganda thing. It had a few basic instruments, but it didn't really serve much practical purpose of this. I think they even had some medals for the Soviet Union on board. The first photograph of the far side of the moon was in October of 1959. It was the Luna 3 mission, another Soviet mission. The names for the Soviet missions tend to be pretty generic. They just call them Lunar for the moon, Venera for Venus. They call them whatever they're going towards. Mars missions for Mars. Yeah. The U.S. had a continual string. The Pioneer 4 was the only remotely successful mission that they had for a long time. And it took much longer for them to have any kind of success. I think they had the next 7 missions failed that were going there. And one of the things I had not really realized, JFK's moon speeches, both of them, happened in the midst of these failures. The first Soviet mission was in 1959. JFK became president in 1961, and he made a speech, later that year to get the Congress on board. And then it was about 2 years later that he did the one at Rice University that's the most famous. But the first U.S. mission to successfully land a hard landing on the moon was in 1964. 5 years after the Soviets had done it. And well after JFK had announced his intention to send humans to the moon. And you gotta wonder just how brazen was it to have that goal when we couldn't even, just launch a missile at it? How were we gonna soft land on there? Well, the first one was the Ranger 7 mission. It was a pretty neat mission. It actually had a camera, so we got some close-up images of the moon. It was the first time that humans had ever seen the moon from close up. And the Ranger program became much more successful after then. By the way, these missions were all controlled by JPL, and at the Ranger 7 mission, I believe they had the now tradition. They passed around some peanuts in the control center, and that was a successful mission. And because that had been their successful mission after having so many failures, then they continued that tradition, and that's something that all JPL missions do now, is they pass around peanuts during critical moments. So just a fun little tradition that they have. The focal point of landing humans on the moon by the end of the 1960s really meant that things had to start taking off. So 1966 was a huge year for the moon. We had the first soft landing on the moon, which was Luna 9. We had the first orbiting spacecraft of the moon, Luna 10. Both of those were Soviet missions. The US also did its first of both of these in 1969. It landed the Surveyor 1 on the moon, and it orbited the Lunar Orbiter 1. And throughout the 1966 and 1967 years, then they continued this tradition, and even early through the 1968 year. But they started to ratchet things up a little bit more, and they really needed to do more. So in 1968, there were two major milestones that were set, one by the Soviets and one by the Americans. The Soviets launched a mission that isn't very well known in the West called Zond 5. And it was really a unique mission of anything else. It was the first and only time that animals were sent into deep space. The Soviet Union sent a number of different types of animals, including two tortoises and some other stuff that I couldn't find all of the details on a mission around the moon. I believe it was just a slingshot around the moon, and then they returned home, and they all came home safely. So this is the first and only time that animals have orbited the moon other than, well, humans. Apollo 8 also successfully orbited humans around the moon, and this time they actually orbited. They didn't just fly around like the Zond 5 mission did. And this happened at the very end of the year. It had the famous reading of Genesis by the Apollo 8 crew on Christmas Eve of 1968.
We are now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light.
And it was really a milestone. And this was the first time that humans had ever been on the Saturn V rocket. Now, they'd done some uncrewed testing of it, but it was kind of a brazen mission. And now that I think about it, the Artemis 2 mission will be a kind of similar situation where they have this new powerful rocket that has been launched once without humans on board, but they're going to test it all the way to the moon. So kind of an interesting little tidbit to history there. 1969, of course, is the big year. I'm sure if you guys are watching this channel, you know that Apollo 11 landed on the surface of the moon carrying the first two humans, Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong being the commander and generally considered to be the first. They landed on the moon, and they walked on the moon, they collected samples, and did all sorts of really neat stuff.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
And return home safely. Apollo 12 also happened this year, and Apollo 10 did most of the mission, but they did not have enough fuel, and they were still not really confident that the spacecraft was capable of landing on the moon and returning them home safely. So they couldn't have done that quite at that point in time. The Soviets also attempted to get samples of the moon. They actually did this at the same time as Apollo 11, but their mission failed that was trying to do this. So they were able to successfully sample the moon in 1970, and they sent a couple of other missions that did this. Of course, we had 6 missions that landed on the moon. We had 2 that went around the moon, 1 that orbited, 3 that went around the moon but did not land, 1 that orbited, Apollo 8, 1 that orbited and started to test the landing sequence, which was Apollo 10, and Apollo 13, which was unable to land because they had a serious issue and they had to return home. But the bottom line is it was an exciting time in spaceflight. The success of the space program led there to be a much diminished effort in going to the moon, and really spaceflight kind of fell out of fad. If we'd been to the moon, we'd kind of been there, had done that. The Soviets never did send any humans to the surface of the moon, but they did collect missions 3 times. They were successful in collecting robotic sample missions. They also sent a couple of rovers that they controlled from Earth. There is roughly a 3-second delay by the time that you take into account the light delay in both directions, getting to and from the moon. But they were able to successfully control them from Earth and actually set some pretty far distance records that were only recently surpassed by rovers operating on the surface of Mars. And the last mission of any note happened in 1976 for a long time, and then people stopped caring about the moon. And we didn't have any missions that went back there for 1990, which was a total of, 14 years? And we didn't have any landers for many, many, many years. It was, I think, only maybe, 5 years ago or something like that, there was another lander on the moon during all of this huge time period where there had not been anything. For 45 years after we landed humans on the moon, we still have not sent a mission, we being the United States, to the surface of the moon since the Apollo program, other than the hard impactor that impacted the South Pole, the lacrosse mission. We kind of haven't been there, done that attitude, but we're starting to get some interest in there again. And the spark started again in 1990. The Japanese sent a mission called the Hitlin. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. The United States sent an orbiter called Clementine, which was able to really observe the entire globe, and it found some kind of evidence of ice in the south pole of the moon, which really all future missions are reliant on some version of that for sending humans, because if we can get ice, then you can do all kinds of things. You can make rocket fuel, you can make air, you can grow plants and drink water and all kinds of good stuff if you have the ability to get water ice or water in general. There were all sorts of things that were started as a result of this. Another fun mission that's personally my favorite little anecdote, the mission HGS-1. This is the first time a commercial satellite had ever visited another celestial body. They visited the moon, not to take images. It didn't have any cameras on board. It was a communication satellite that had failed to enter the proper orbit, but they actually found out that if they did a couple of flybys of the moon, that they could adjust their orbit such that their onboard rocket fuel was enough to get them into the geostationary orbit and get a few years of life out of it. Nobody's ever attempted this since, but it's a fun little bit of history that could theoretically be done and would be pretty cool to see done again. We had ESA and China also entering the game to explore the moon, and then we had an event which probably won't be well known in history, but it was the Ansari Google X Prize, where we had a funded effort to land a spacecraft on the moon with a high definition camera and take some video and then move another 500 meters or something like that and take another video. And there were a number of contenders to make some kind of progress in that, but none of them actually ended up launching during the window. The prize is now closed. One of them, only one of them, actually launched, but after the X Prize had closed. And they were able to successfully orbit the moon, but they failed in landing. This is the Beresheet lander, which is the first attempted private landing on the moon, and the first time a private spacecraft had deliberately gone to the moon, had orbited the moon, and quite frankly, I think it is a huge potential for the future that this kind of thing would happen. They launched on a SpaceX rocket. We've also had India and South Korea join the game, sending orbiters of their own. We've had China land on the far side of the moon and send its own rovers and even grow something on the moon, which is pretty cool. We have sent another human-rated vehicle to go around the moon, the Artemis 1 mission, which just a few months ago launched on the world's most powerful rocket, the SLS rocket, although that title will soon be claimed by SpaceX's Starship and Super Heavy. And we, generally speaking, have a plan to get back to the moon. This is some exciting times. I look forward to seeing this happen. We have not sent humans to the moon right now for over 50 years, and I've said this before. When I was young, I used to think that if we hit 50 years that we had not sent humans to the moon, that would be a sad, sad day. And that timer has been kind of in the back of my mind. And I realized a few years ago, by the time I started recording this, that we were probably not going to make that goal. And we're already past it. It's too late. But at least we have a plan, and we have spacecraft that are starting to make the journey. And soon, we'll have humans orbiting the moon and then humans landing on the moon maybe 4 or 5 years from now. Hopefully. We'll see how things go. Thank you guys so much for joining me. Let me know whatever questions or comments you guys have. And thanks for everything. Until next time, keep on tracking. Take care, guys.